Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for taking a break from Netflix to join us this evening. I'm Maureen McDonald. I'm the Dean of Science at McMaster University, and I'm so thrilled that Connie and Joe have added this speaker series to our McCall MacBain Postdoctoral Fellows Teaching and Learning Program. Online events perhaps are one of the only silver linings in this pandemic. We get to bring people together from near and far who share our passions, including our passion for science. Like you, I look forward to hearing from Kaylee, Rodrigo, James, and Leanne this evening. I'm always impressed by scientists who can explain their research and life's work in 10 minutes or less. I know that my family continually complains that I have not yet mastered that skill. If you haven't already, I'd encourage you to go to the Conversation Canada after tonight's web event. That's where you can read op-eds published by 3 of tonight's presenters and many other interesting published conversations on wide-ranging topics. Submitting these op-eds is one of the homework assignments for the postdoctoral fellows who are enrolled in our program. 9 op-eds have been published by our postdocs over the last 2 years, and still more to come. Getting published and speaking at events like this is critically important. It's not enough to be a brilliant researcher these days. Now more than ever, as demonstrated by the pandemic, scientists must be great communicators. If we want people to care about science, to truly believe in it, to trust scientists and fund more science, then we need to find ways to make our research relevant and interesting to many people. And that is exactly what's going to happen tonight. Thanks to Kaylee, Rodrigo, James, and Leanne. I'd also like to thank Connie and Joe. Together, they've built this amazing program from the ground up, just from a seed of a conversation that Joe and I had a few years ago with our funders. And this program has certainly exceeded all expectations. And what I've learned as the Dean is that that really is due to the investment and the trust and the passion of the people who lead and develop these programs. You're giving postdoctoral fellows, Connie and Joe, unique opportunities to hone their communication and leadership skills. What they learn from you and our program and from each other will influence their careers as scientists, researchers, and leaders of labs, department, faculty, and community organizations. Several of the postdoctoral fellows from last year's program are now faculty members here at McMaster and at universities across North America. And finally, I'd like to thank our funders, Marcy and John McCall MacBain, for generously investing in this one-of-a-kind program. For Marcy, who is a graduate from our kinesiology program, this was an investment in her alma mater. Because of your leadership, transformative opportunities have been afforded to dozens of postdoctoral fellows, and now we have an opportunity to share their leadership with this wide audience. So thanks again to everyone for joining us this evening and for sharing our passion for transforming the world through science. I'll now pass it over to Joe Kim, who's going to give some introduction of our speakers this evening.
Thank you so much, Dean McDonald. And we'd like to virtually welcome you to McMaster University tonight. We called this event Appetizers for the Mind, and you are in for an eclectic intellectual treat. Tonight, we're going to hear from 4 of our future scientific leaders on topics ranging from the secret life of fat and glacial floods to creating an action plan for physical health and getting a bird's eye view on romance. I'd like to introduce tonight's first speaker, Dr. Kaylee Robertson. Kaylee is a comparative physiologist who completed her PhD work with Grant McClellan here at McMaster University. She hails from the East Coast near the Bay of Fundy, which I will point out has the highest tides in the world. She studies how baby animals and their moms cope with their environment, whether they live in the depths of the ocean or on the summits of the Rocky Mountains. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kaylee Robertson.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Joe. And thank you everyone for taking this opportunity to be here with us today. We're all really excited to get the chance to share our research and our passions with all of you. Before we get started, I want everyone just to take a moment and think about a part of our bodies that we don't often like to consider, which is our body fat. And I want you to try and come up with one good thing that your body fat does for you. You can put it in the chat of the webinar if you want to, or you can just say it to your pet or your partner, whoever's watching this with you, or just think it to yourself. And if you can't think of anything at all, that's okay, because today we're going to talk about 3 secrets that your fat is keeping from you, and what this little tiny mouse of all things can teach us about how to unravel those mysteries. So when we talk about fat, what do we actually mean? We're usually talking about adipose tissue, which is a connective tissue that is all around our body that contains adipocyte cells. And these cells store excess energy from the food that we eat in the form of triglycerides. When we need that energy later to do something like exercise, those triglycerides get broken down into fuel that can be used by our metabolically active tissues like our muscle. And this is a really important adaptation for us and for all kinds of different animals, because it allows us to carry an energy-dense fuel source on our bodies all the time. It's sort of like going for a hike and having a backpack full of snacks. Now, for a really long time, a lot of scientists thought that this was really the only job aside from insulation that fat had. And it's probably what came to mind when I asked you the question at the beginning of this talk. But we now know that fat is much more complicated than this. And there's many different types of fat that does different jobs. I study what's known as brown adipose tissue, which has these brown adipocyte cells, and they don't store energy to use later. They burn energy in order to produce heat. Now, this heat-producing brown fat is one of the things that's unique to placental mammals, just like us. And it was first discovered a long time ago in 1551 in this angry little fellow, marmots. But it took an embarrassingly long 400 years for us to figure out what brown fat actually does. And the reason it took so long is because marmots are hibernators. And so we thought that brown fat was just some weird thing to help with hibernation. And it does help hibernators. It allows them to heat up their vital organs like their brains and their hearts and their lungs first when they're waking up out of their hibernation state where their body temperature is really low. But it's useful for a lot of other things aside from hibernation. It's particularly helpful for animals who live in cold climates, especially if they are small and are going to lose heat really rapidly to their environment. And it's also really critical for newborn babies. And that's because when we're first born, our muscles aren't mature enough to shiver. So we have brown fat all around our vital organs to keep us nice and toasty warm. So I study how baby mammals who live in different environments use their brown fat in different ways. And for my PhD work, I worked on the North American deer mouse. And this is a great model for understanding how animals live in different environments, because the North American deer mouse lives everywhere on the continent, including in my basement here in Hamilton. But for my research, I'm interested in the mice who live here at the summit of the tallest mountains in the Rockies. And the baby deer mice who live here have evolved to use their brown fat in a really interesting way. In fact, when they get cold, they don't use it at all. They just let their body temperature drop. And that's really different from what the baby mice who live at lower elevations do. When they get cold, they use their brown fat, just like a baby human does, to keep their bodies warm. But highlanders have evolved to shut their brown fat down, and we think they do this because they don't want to waste all of their precious body fat stores trying to stay warm. They just let their moms do all the work for them. But why should you care about these tiny little mountain mice and their freaky heat-producing fat? Well, you should care because you have brown fat too. Or at least you have white fat cells that can sometimes act like brown fat. We didn't used to think that adult humans had any brown adipose tissue, but now we know that they do. And the more of these beige or brown fat cells that you have, the more metabolically healthy you tend to be. They don't seem to produce a lot of heat, but they do burn a lot of energy. And they can be protective against things like diet-induced obesity and diabetes. And so there's a lot of research focused now on trying to understand how healthy fat acts in our bodies under normal circumstances, whether it's white or beige or brown. And one of the things that we've learned is that fat is actually a really important endocrine organ. What this means is that our fat cells produce hormones, and those hormones communicate with all of the other tissues in our body. So while you've been sitting here listening to me talk, your fat cells have been sending out over 1,000 different types of messages that can regulate everything from your metabolism to how hungry you feel. Now, just because something sends out a lot of messages doesn't mean we understand what those messages mean. And for the most part, what these fat hormones do remain a mystery to us. We do know that they seem to be really important for metabolic health. So the mouse on the right is missing the hormone, the gene to produce just one of these fat hormones. And this is especially true of the hormones produced in brown fat. And this is where our high altitude baby deer mice can come back into the picture. What we can do is we can move out of the lab and we can study wild animals who have evolved to use their brown fat and regulate it in different ways. We can study the hormones that they produce to try and give us an idea of what those messages actually mean. So if you take one thing from this talk, I hope it's that you understand now that your fat is a lot more complicated than we ever thought it was before. And that we can learn a lot about how our bodies work from studying weird little animals who live in strange places. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Kaylee, for teaching us about brown fat tissue. So I'd just like to introduce myself. I am Connie Imbo, and I'm the Program Manager and Research Coordinator for the McCall MacBain Postdoctoral Fellows Teaching and Leadership Program. And before we get into our next talk, I just wanted to ask you a question, Kaylee, that comes from the audience. And we wanted to know, how did you get started studying such a niche topic like baby animals?
Well, thanks, Connie. That's a really good question. When I first started getting into research, I actually wasn't interested in baby animals in particular. What I wanted to study was something called developmental plasticity. And that's the idea that the environmental conditions that we experience when we're little can have really long-term effects on our traits that we have as adults. And that's something that's been talked about for a really long time in fields like human behavior. We've debated nature versus nurture for hundreds of years. But when it comes to physiology, it's not really something that we're kind of way behind the game. And whether that's human physiology and how our early environment influences health and disease, or animal physiology and how early environment influences adult traits in the wild animals that we care about. And so that's kind of how I came about it in a roundabout way.
Thank you so much, Kaylee.
Okay, thanks so much, Kaylee. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Rodrigo Naro Perez. Rodrigo is a member of the Glacial Sedimentology Lab, whose research looks at using glacial sedimentology and geomorphology to understand glacial hazards and the impacts of climate change on mountain environments. He was born in Peru and is likely to call the Cordillera Blanca, located in northern Peruvian Andes, as his main field site for his work. He's also interested in all things Latin American, especially food and music, field-based experiential education, and anti-racism work. His artist of the decade on Spotify is Shakira. Thank you very much, and I will pass you on to Rodrigo.
Thank you, Joe, for that introduction, and thank you, Kaylee, for a great talk about our fats that I'm kind of glad I gained a little bit more through this pandemic. So thank you, everyone, for being here, and I'm going to ask that you imagine something that might be hard, but please bear with me. Imagine that sometime in the near future, everyone has been vaccinated against COVID, and now we're able to travel. So you have finally decided to visit the wonderful South American country of Peru. And before you head down to visit the famous site of Machu Picchu, you decide to go hiking and see some Peruvian glaciers that you didn't know were there before. So you decide to go visit the city of Huaraz in northern Peru. You fall in love with this city filled with history and Andean culture, and you're excited for tomorrow to start early in the morning your hike to your first Peruvian glacier. You wake up at 5 in the morning and you set off. You've arrived to this beautiful lake and your breath is taken away, and this time not by the lack of oxygen due to the altitude. After 3 hours, you can finally see the glaciers in the horizon, but you hear something strange. You hear flowing water and something just doesn't feel right. So you decide to go back to town to Huaraz. And as you start hiking down, you see the water has turned browner, water level in the river has risen, and you start seeing people moving to higher ground. And as you keep going further down valley, you start to see destruction. And as you come closer to town, you see a city that is nothing like the one you left this morning. You didn't know it, but in the valley south of where you were hiking, a glacial lake outburst flood or a glut occurred and brought unwanted destruction to the city of Huaraz. Today, I'll be talking about deconstructing glacial lake outburst floods and show you all a little bit of the work that we do in the Glacial Sedimentology Research Lab led by Dr. Carolyn Isles. As many of you know, glaciers are one of the most magnificent natural wonders of this world. But unfortunately, due to climate change, they are retreating and melting at unprecedented rates. A question that many people have is, where does all this water from the glaciers go? And to answer that question, we can go to the Cordillera Blanca, located in this little red box, which is exactly where you went hiking, to answer that question. And if we look in the image on the right, you actually see that the answer is pretty simple. The water ponds in front of these glaciers. If we look at another lake, this one called Lake Calcacocha in the Cordillera Blanca, you see this beautiful large blue lake. And on the image on the right, you see that something is impounding this lake and not letting the water go through. And this something is called the moraine. And a moraine is a glacial landform that is comprised of an assortment of sands, gravels, clays, and silts of all sizes and shapes that have been pushed, squeezed, or bulldozed by glaciers into the form that you see in front of you. These moraines are natural dams. They hold back the water and can hold a lot of force, but they are very unstable and can break at any point. There are various events that can cause this to break, and they are anything from rock and ice avalanches, heavy rain, earthquakes, or ice calving from the glaciers in front, and they create big waves with enough force to break through the moraine, this natural dam, and bring destructive force to the communities below. You didn't know it before you visited Huaraz, but Huaraz has actually experienced quite a bit of gluts in its history. In 1941, a glut from Lake Calcacocha killed over 2,000 people, and in 1970, over 15,000 people perished from another glut. You may have not known, but unfortunately, Peru is the country in the world that has experienced the most deaths due to glacial hazards. So as a Peruvian and a Canadian researcher, we want to really understand how we can stop and mitigate such disasters from occurring. So let's go back to these moraines. And something that we use in my lab is glacial sedimentology and geomorphology to really understand how these moraines are formed, and particularly the structure and architecture of these moraines. To do this, we'll go to one of our field sites in southern Iceland, here in this glacier, Gigjökull. And as you can see where the red arrow is, we see this exposure of a moraine that is really, that we really want to get to and analyze. Unfortunately, it might not be obvious, but this is about 100 meters in height. And it's actually pretty steep, so it's something dangerous, and we cannot climb that. So we use something that some of you may be familiar with, which is a drone or a UAV, and we use this to access this previously inaccessible site. So we go into this area, which is in the red square, and we want to really look at it through this drone. So we take thousands of high-resolution images, and then through the magical power of computers, we stitch them together to create high-resolution images that can be then analyzed. And we create photo mosaics, such as the one here below. From this mosaics, because they're such high quality, we can zoom in even further and start analyzing and looking at areas where we see areas of high hydraulic conductivity. And for those who might be unfamiliar with this term, it's a measurement of what is the ease at which water can move through these areas and create instability. So the more water that moves through, it's going to make this marine area a lot weaker in stability. And with further analysis, we can start looking at areas with medium and low hydraulic conductivity or areas of medium and low water leakage. And identifying these areas within the structure of a moraine is important because then we can give this information to geologists and engineers to identify areas where remediation projects can be built in this moraine, such as the dams you see in front of you and some of the lakes that we've worked at. Like many of us, you may be sitting in Southern Ontario, although perhaps there's folks from all around the globe, and you look at this map and look at the Peruvian Andes, it's a little bit far from us. But in reality, about 10% of the world's population lives in areas that will be prone to gloves in decades to come. And within the Canadian context, some of you may also be familiar with one of Canada's most iconic glaciers, the Athabasca Glacier. And as you can see on the image on the right, this glacier has not been, has experienced glacier retreat from 1918 to 2011, and it is estimated that by the end of the century, the Athabasca Glacier will be completely gone. So in fact, the Western Canadian Rockies have also experienced gloves in the past, and we'll see an increase in events in the future. And that is why we believe in the Glacial Sedimentology Lab that understanding this great glacial landforms known as moraines is an important way in which we can tackle this global scientific problem. And in addition, we hope that if you ever go hiking in the Peruvian Andes, you will be met with a glove-free hike. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk, Rodrigo. And with all of your beautiful photos, I'm sure you must have some interesting stories to tell us about your fieldwork. So what's your favorite one that you'd like to share?
I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite, but it is a memorable one, which I was with my lab mate, Rebecca Lee, and we were at a glacier 4 hours north of where I took this photo mosaic, and we were trying to collect data using a drone. And sometimes, you know, weather can be unpredictable, and we were hit with an ice storm that lasted for about 3 hours, and getting to really far away remote sites, in particularly in places such as Iceland, its time is precious, and we couldn't afford to come another day. So we waited out the hailstorm for 3 hours, protecting the equipment over us, and we still were able to collect the data, but it just shows that it is very important. Field work, it's unpredictable. We don't like it. I know that if I survive that, I can survive other weather events, but yeah, it makes it both fun, exciting, and sometimes a little bit wild.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Rodrigo. And I'm sure you're happy to be in Southern Ontario now.
All right. Thank you so much. Already learning so much. Our next speaker is Dr. James McHenry. James is currently a postdoctoral fellow working in the lab of Professor Stuart Phillips' Protein Metabolism Research Group right here at McMaster University in the Department of Kinesiology. The focus of James's research is to explore the adaptive response of human skeletal muscle to use, i.e. resistance and aerobic exercise, disuse, i.e. immobilization and bed rest, and sarcopenia of aging. Speaking of aging, James notes that at the beginning of his PhD, he had 20/20 vision and a full head of hair. I will pass you on to James for more details.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Joe. Good evening, everybody, and thank you all very much for taking the time to come and listen to these presentations. With the holiday period just behind us, I think it's probably safe to assume that many of you will have just spent a large portion of that period being a total couch potato, during which I'm also willing to bet that most of you have been stuffing your face with chocolate and snacks. And if you're anything like me, you will have been binge watching Christmas movies on Netflix. Well, what do you get for being a couch potato? A trophy. Yay, right? Well, not quite. you get a special type of trophy. You get muscle atrophy. If you can't immediately tell, I'm from the UK, and if any of you have ever been across the pond and visited, you'll be familiar with the fact that our winters are sometimes a little chilly, but mostly they're pretty wet, which, to be honest, isn't that much different from the summer. For those of you here in Canada, it's often too cold, in some cases too dangerous, and quite often rather impractical to go outside during the coldest days of winter. Given that we are in the midst of the normal, whatever that means nowadays, flu season, and with COVID-19 cases still surging, lockdowns happening, curfews imminent, and vaccines being rolled out at a snail's pace, combined with the Christmas holidays just behind us, it is very likely that many of us have just spent and will be spending a significant amount of time like this over the coming weeks and probably even months. Well, believe it or not, and this probably shouldn't come as a shock to you, but that might not be the best approach if you want to stay healthy for this winter and beyond. Physical inactivity can be forced upon a person by an acute event, such as a broken arm or leg, or becoming bedbound due to an illness. However, reduced physical activity, such as step reduction, is a long-term choice that brings about multiple negative health consequences. It's safe to assume, I think, that many of us understand the benefits of physical activity: increased muscle mass, muscle strength, reduced risk of disease development, and a better overall quality of life. However, we tend to be far less aware of how damaging reduced physical activity can be for our health. And this is particularly problematic for older couch potatoes, as they just don't possess the same bounce back ability as from these acute periods of reduced activity that younger couch potatoes do. Our research group has now performed several studies within which we reduced the daily step count of older individuals by about 75% to around 1,500 steps per day. This is a number similar to those that a housebound during the pandemic would typically take, and is probably viewed by most as a particularly benign change in activity. However, we've shown that in just 2 weeks of reduced activity, that can have disastrous consequences for older people's health. Specifically, we showed that 2 weeks of physical inactivity led to a decrease in muscle size by up to 4%, an increase in insulin resistance by up to 1/3, and this is a warning sign for the development of type 2 diabetes. But we also know that inactivity leads to an increase in body fat, and in particular ectopic fat deposition, precisely where you don't want it around your organs, as this is a significant risk factor for several diseases. And finally, inactivity can significantly impact one's mental health and lead to social isolation, which can be a significant concern amongst older individuals and those undergoing the current pandemic. Thankfully, it's not all doom and gloom, and there are a number of things you can do throughout this winter with your muscles intact to stay fit and healthy. Resistance exercise or strength training remains to be the most potent strategy to maintain or increase your muscle and strength. So if you're fortunate enough to have access to a gym or some sort of home gym setup, that's awesome. And I'd recommend, in line with the World Health Organization's recent guidelines, that individuals both young and old participate in some form of resistance exercise or muscle strengthening activities at least twice per week, targeting the major muscle groups. However, I've got some good news for those of you that don't have the same access to exercise facilities. It doesn't have to be quite so complicated. There are tons of alternatives you can do at home, such as bodyweight exercises like push-ups, squats, lunges, or with some very basic equipment like resistance band, you can perform a pretty good home workout. Ultimately, if you perform them with a high degree of effort, such that it feels pretty difficult, you're going to get stronger and prevent at least some of that muscle mass loss. However, while resistance exercise is a great option, it's not always feasible or appealing to individuals despite its health benefits. And if this is the case, then reducing the amount of time you spend being sedentary can go a long way to keeping you healthy. Simply adding a daily walk by yourself or with a partner, or taking the dog for a walk, wearing your mask appropriately, of course, or perhaps going for a bike ride or a run, or even climbing some of Hamilton's many stairs are excellent alternatives. Or perhaps you could try incorporating some lower intensity strengthening exercises like yoga or Pilates to your daily routine. And all of these simple, easily achievable strategies can have a significant physical and mental health benefits. And adding them to your daily schedule with a partner or friend will increase the likelihood of you actually doing them. Put simply, for muscle and more generally overall health, it truly is a case of move it or lose it. To wrap things up, and if there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from this talk, given how quickly reduced physical activity can sap your strength and damage your health, getting up off the couch and doing something now is the best way to power through this cold, dark winter and beyond, so that you don't become that champion couch potato in the race for muscle atrophy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James, for your talk. And I'm just looking at the poll answers. And unfortunately for me and the majority of our audience, a lot of us are hovering around about 3,000 steps today. So I just want to hear, how have you been staying active? And have you tried anything new since the lockdown?
Unfortunately, for those of you that answered around 3,000, that's probably not good enough to keep your health throughout the winter. But that's a really good question, Connie. Once the gyms closed for the second time in the fall, anticipating this current COVID crisis might not resolve itself as quickly as we might like, my housemates and I converted our garage into some sort of makeshift gym with some weights, a bike turbo trainer, and a rowing machine. But to be honest, my favorite thing to do whilst we're stuck at home is going for a pretty long, maybe an hour-long walk. I live in the Chinook neighborhood of Hamilton, so I'm able to tackle some of those stairs that I highlighted. And because I like to be efficient, I also combine that by listening to an audiobook.
Thank you for that, James. I'm thinking of going for a walk after this tonight myself. I'm at about 1,500 steps, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's the same as those that took part in the step reduction study, so that needs fixing, I'm afraid.
All right, thank you so much, James and Connie. Our final speaker for this evening is Dr. Leanne Greaves. Leanne completed her master's degree at McMaster University before going on to complete her PhD at Western University. She joins us again as a postdoctoral researcher at McMaster this fall. She studies animal behavior and communication, specializing on how birds smell and how smell influences their behavior. In her spare time, you can find Leanne being very active, training mixed martial arts, hiking, or bird watching somewhere around the Hamilton area, presumably not all at once. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leanne Greaves.
Thanks, Joe. I also have to confess, I fortunately did go for a walk today, so I'm at 4,000 steps, but yeah, I'm feeling a little bit guilty about it. So yeah, thanks so much everyone for coming to these presentations today. Now that we've learned a little bit about what our fat can do for us and small mammals, we've taken a trip to Peru, and we've all kind of got a great reminder to get our act together when it comes to fitness. I'd like to talk a little bit about dating. So to start, I want to invite everyone to just take a moment to imagine your ideal mate. And while you probably pictured some of the physical characteristics you find attractive, I'm willing to bet that you didn't imagine how your ideal mate should smell. For those of us who want to start a family, it's important that we choose a high-quality partner. This is someone who can help provide care for us and our children, who can help us maintain the home, and who can protect us from danger. These characteristics are not only important to us as humans, they're also important to species that raise their children in pairs or groups, and this includes birds. So how do we choose the right partner? We all have a unique body odor, and we can think of this as our own distinct perfume. And it turns out that both humans and animals can use this body odor to choose a good mate. Our body odor is influenced by many different factors. Our diet can affect the way we smell, the amount of stress that we may be under, whether we're healthy or ill can influence our odor, and so can the bacteria and fungi that naturally live on and in our bodies. Our genes can also influence our body odor, and it's these genetic effects on odors that I'll be focusing on today. All fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, including us humans, have a special set of immune genes called the major histocompatibility complex, or MHC for short. These MHC genes make proteins that allow our bodies to recognize and fight off harmful disease-causing pathogens. Here's an example of how this works. The MHC gene region, pictured here, produces MHC proteins. These proteins can recognize and bind harmful pathogens. When our unique MHC proteins recognize the pathogen, it can then be destroyed. So the more genetic diversity we have at MHC, the more different proteins we can make, and the more different pathogens we can defend against. This means that genetic diversity at MHC is good, but it also means that when we're ready to start a family, we should choose a partner who is genetically different from us, so that our kids will be genetically diverse at MHC as well. Birds, like humans, are more likely to raise a healthy family if their mate is genetically unrelated to them. But how can we tell whether a potential partner is a good genetic match? Our body odor may hold the key. Believe it or not, in the 1990s, researchers convinced a group of women to rate their preferences for the smell of men's t-shirts that had been worn for several days. Importantly, these shirts were all for men who differed in their MHC genotypes. This so-called sweaty t-shirt experiment showed that women preferred the odor of men who were different from themselves at MHC. So I wanted to know whether birds, like humans, prefer the odor of MHC dissimilar potential mates. So I designed my own sweaty t-shirt experiment to test this. I gave birds a choice between the odor of opposite sex conspecifics who were more or less similar to themselves at MHC. So for example, females were given odor from a male who was either dissimilar to her at MHC or similar to her at MHC. And males received the same test. They could spend time with odor of an MHC dissimilar female or an MHC similar female's odor. In both cases, I predicted that birds should spend more time with the odor of an MHC dissimilar potential mate, indicating a preference for that odor. So what did I find? I'm about to show you exactly that, but first I would just like to walk you through the information that's going to come up on this figure. So on the horizontal on the vertical axis, I'll show the amount of time that the birds in this experiment spent with each sample for a total of up to 600 seconds or 10 minutes, which was the duration of this experiment. And on the horizontal axis, I will show the amount of time spent with the MHC similar odor sample and the MHC dissimilar odor sample. And these data will show as the average response of all birds that participated in the study, both males and females. So what did I find? Both females and males spent significantly more time with the body odor of MHC dissimilar potential mates. So males spent more time with MHC dissimilar female odor compared to the time they spent with MHC similar female odor, and females did the same thing. Just like in the human study, these birds seem to prefer the odor of an MHC dissimilar mate. So we know that both birds and humans prefer the scent of a genetically different partner. This can help us ensure that our offspring are healthy and able to fight off harmful pathogens. It turns out that we have quite a lot in common with our feathered friends. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to our Q&A at the end of the talk.
Hi, Leanne. Thank you so much for that talk. We just have a question for you. So I know a lot of people who typically do field work were unable to do any work because of the pandemic. How has COVID affected your work?
Yeah, that's a big question for a lot of folks these days, for sure. I was affected. I was supposed to be doing research on some really cool tropical birds in Puerto Rico right now, but fortunately, I was able to develop a local field research-based project that I was able to complete this fall at the Long Point Bird Observatory. So I'm pretty lucky that I still got to get out into the field. A lot of people were not able to do that, unfortunately. But one challenge that I'm facing now is that I'm having a little bit of trouble getting into the lab to process my data because there's a lot of shipping and supply delays right now. So I have to say I've been pretty lucky overall, though.
Thanks so much, Leanne. So we've got a couple of activities left. We've got some great questions from our audience joining us today. So I'm going to ask our speakers to come back online. We're going to go through a few questions, and then you'll have a chance to test out how well you've been paying attention tonight in a pub quiz, complete with prizes. So first question is for Kaylee, and this is a question that comes directly from the audience. What makes brown fat brown?
Good question. So brown fat actually does look brown, and white fat looks white. And the reason for the color is the amount of fat oil droplets they have versus mitochondria. So white fat cells, those white adipocytes, are full of one giant droplet of oil, and it's the same color as like the olive oil that you have in your cabinet, and that's why they appear that color. But brown fat is full of mitochondria, and mitochondria are like a dark reddish brown color. And so that's what gives it its distinctive color, and that's actually how they produce heat as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question up is for Rodrigo. We have a technical question. Do you use GIS? And perhaps you could tell us what GIS is. And do you apply this to data, to maps, to help locate GLOFs?
Thank you. First I'll start with GIS as Geographic Information Systems, which actually McMaster is known for having great amount of researchers, and we have a research lab on Burke Science Building that hopefully one day we'll all get back to go. But it's using sort of computer software to identify glacial lakes, and so the answer is yes and no. And for the first one would be, for a lot of the work that we do, we rely on our partners in Peru, so we do international work, for them to identify the lakes that historically have had glacial lake events, and they know the site really works. So we really rely on their local expertise. But then when it comes to, once those lakes have been identified, we use GIS as well as Google Earth to really look and analyze the lakes that have been identified by our partners. You could, but when we're doing this kind of international work, we really value the local knowledge. They're the ones who live in the area, and that's their expertise. So it's a combination. You could, but I think when you put in both methods together, you get the best result.
Okay, thank you, Rodrigo. Next question we have is for Leanne. So how do birds figure out when you put out bird seed? It seems like they're right on it right away. Is that smell as well?
That's a fun question, thanks. So birds can definitely use smell to find food. For example, birds like vultures or seabirds, especially the seabirds that spend often days out on the open ocean, they'll use smell quite heavily to find food. But the songbirds, the kind of birds that are usually visiting feeders, are more likely to rely on their sense of sight to find food. And they can do that in a couple of ways. Birds that have a territory will spend some time exploring that territory, and then they can actually seek out and memorize the locations of different food sources, and they'll visit them frequently. And birds that don't live in the area that might be migrating through can actually use cues of where other birds are going as they travel through, and sort of go where the birds are going and look for food sources that way.
Okay, thanks very much. Our next question is for James. How many steps are in that 1 hour walk that you go on? And maybe just give us a bit more advice on how do you get motivated to do this?
That's a very good question. I mean, it depends a little bit on height and the speed within which you walk. I would say typically around the hour-long walk for me is about 7,500 steps. So close to the 8,000 threshold that people should be achieving each day. To get motivated, that's a very different question. I think hopefully making people aware of the benefits of physical activity, but also on the flip side of that, making sure that people know how damaging inactivity can be, and how long it takes to recover from some people. So yeah.
Okay, thanks so much, James. One more question for Kaylee. One of our viewers asked, is carrying some body fat good for you? If so, how much fat would be considered good?
A very loaded question. So I'll preface it by saying that I'm not a human biologist or any sort of clinician. So I would never say a number of body composition that I think would be appropriate. And I think it varies from individual to individual. But yes, having body fat is really critical part of your health. One, we need fat to fuel a lot of the different metabolic processes in our body. And adipose tissue isn't the only place we store lipids. We have some inside of our muscle cells as well, but it is the primary place where we store them for fuel. And we also really need those fat-derived hormones. And so if you have really low body fat, and you can result in having really low production of those hormones, it can cause a lot of different health problems. Women will lose their menstrual cycle, it can have bone density problems, fertility. It has all kinds of off-target effects other than just kind of the metabolic side of things that we often consider.
Okay, thank you very much. Question for Rodrigo. A very practical question here. Are there initiatives to turn the threats of glacial lakes into an asset, for example, as a source of fresh water?
Yes, okay, so I didn't say it, we don't, not enough time, but all the lakes that I showed are actually water reservoirs for the towns down valley. So in a lot of them, they have dams where you can regulate how much water is flowing. So one of the things that I like to say, and there's some research and a lot of people working, we really call it the dualities of water. Water we often associate with life, but as you can see, water can also bring death and destruction, and they're coming from the same lake. So for a lot of the areas, they are reservoirs, they do control them. Sometimes you just gotta measure the risk and how unstable the moraines are. But in many of the areas, they are just big water reservoirs. So it's really understanding. Some are just very unstable where you don't want to switch and regulate the dam. Well, for some, like the one where we studied in Papicocha, that dam, that remediation project that's been done is fairly okay, it's fairly stable, and that water provides most, if not all, the water of the main part of the city of Juarez. So when we're there, we're drinking that water.
Okay, thanks so much. And a question for Leanne. Very interesting to hear about the romantic world of birds. You said that females prefer certain male traits and phenotypes. So the question from one of our audience members is, does smell trump other traits in female sexual selection?
Yeah, that's a good question. First, I think something that was quite interesting that I found in my research was that not only did the females have that preference, but the males did too. And in the birds that I studied, both sexes spend quite a bit of time caring for the young. So it makes sense that both sexes might be engaging in that mate choice process. And somewhat similar to humans, we're not only assessing one trait when we choose a mate. We might think about physical appearance, but we're probably also evaluating, maybe the kind of job and hobbies someone has, how they treat their family, and maybe a little bit how they smell. And birds are somewhat similar. They'll also assess multiple traits. So we know absolutely, especially with females, they'll assess the quality of a male's song. Males and females can both assess the quality of the plumage or the feathers that their potential mates have. And I think that it's quite possible that smell is another component that they are evaluating, but it's probably not the main or the major component, just like that's probably not the main thing that we might use either.
Thank you so much. And we have one final question for James. So you talked about how being sedentary could be detrimental at different time points in life. Can you make the case that it's never too late asking for a friend?
You definitely can. There's always something you can do, and picking up exercise no matter what age is always going to be a good idea. I briefly touched upon it during the presentation when I threw up the image of the older couch potato, but it depends on a couple of factors. But in general, younger people have a far greater ability to recover from these shorter periods of reduced physical activity than older people. In fact, older individuals often display this phenomenon called anabolic resistance, which simply put means they're less able to mount this muscle building response to exercise and protein nutrition. And that's something that's not present in younger individuals. That being said, they're not completely resistant, and doing something is always going to be better than doing nothing.
Thank you so much, James. If you are interested in hearing more about James's work and his research on exercise, please join us on February 2nd for another talk. We'll momentarily put the link in the chat so that you can copy and paste it and see details of that talk. Okay, thank you, everyone. That brings an end to our formal presentations. And now we invite you to test your skills at how well you've been paying attention to these appetizers for the mind in the form of a pub quiz. And there will be prizes. And we're going to take about a 3-minute break right now to go over your extensive notes, which I'm assuming you've taken, to get ready for this quiz. Instructions will be posted momentarily so that you will be able to join us. And for those of you who are unable to join us, I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event.